Well, first of all, thank you for having me here today. It's an honor to be here. Yes, it's true I've made my career in the music business in the States, but I think it's worth spending a minute to say that I actually started my music career here in Israel. When I was a very young man, at age 20, I was a DJ on The Voice of Peace. And I lived on the peace ship and broadcast there. And then afterwards, I actually spent 2 years where I worked at Kol I was the Tel Aviv correspondent for the news in English on Reshet Aleph, I think it was. And I also worked in a lot of clubs back then as a DJ. I worked at the Penguin Club and the Kol Noadon and Liquid and the Coliseum and everywhere. So it was a long time ago. It was a very long time ago. It was in the early to mid-'80s. But then I went off to back to America, and I've been in the music business for a little over 30 years. I started at Warner. Actually, one of the big stars that we had at Warner back when I first started my career was Ofer Chaza, who had her run of success in the late 80s, and that was very exciting. Later on, I became head of A&R, artists and repertoire, for Mercury Records, and the big record that I did in that period that I think was a very big hit here in Israel was Bop by Hanson, which I produced back in the 90s. And then I started my own record label, and I only started my own record label because I had this idea for a record that I thought would be the biggest record in the world. I had this crazy thing, and I worked for months on this record in my friend's living room, and then I tried to bring it into a major label, and they laughed at me. And just to prove that I was right, that it could be a big hit, and that they were wrong, I started my own record label. I had no funding, I had nothing, I just had a record, which sometimes is enough, is just to have a good record. And I started S-Curve Records in the summer of 2000, and the record that I put out to prove that it was that I was right, that it was a hit, was a record called Who Let the Dogs Out. And, and in fact, if you know that record, and I guess most people here know the record, that's actually me barking on the record. So. And then I went on, we had a lot of successful records, and I eventually sold the label to EMI and became president of Columbia Records for a few years. Probably the most notable thing I did there was a group called the Jonas Brothers. And then I restarted S-Curve Records again, and that's what I do until this day. I sold S-Curve Records to BMG 3 years ago, but I still run it, and we have a lot of hits. Actually, I'm very happy this week. My label has a top 10 album with a group called AJR in the States, and a top 10 single with a guy named Andy Grammer in the States. So it's a good time to be at S-Curve Records. But I want to talk a little bit about technology and music, which is why I'm here. You know, I always look at the relationship between music and technology as the 140-year war, I call it. You know, the record player was invented in 1877 by Thomas Edison, and immediately people who loved music thought it was the end of music, because back then the only way you could hear music was if someone made music live in front of you. And people said, oh, now that there's records, people are going to not learn how to play the piano, they're not going to learn how to sing, they're not going to form orchestras, they're just going to let a few people do it and they'll listen to records. And of course we know that that wasn't the case, right? That in fact the coming of recorded music only spread music throughout the world, and it was a great thing. But you see that there was already a tension between music and technology. Not only was there a tension between music and technology and the question of who's going to create music, but there also was a tension of who would have the upper hand, music or technology. Thomas Edison, a very interesting character, even as the recording industry grew in the late 1800s and the early 1900s and stars started to emerge on a lot of the different record labels, Thomas Edison never put the name of the singer or of the orchestra on any of his records that he put out. Whenever you bought a record from Thomas Edison's record label, it had a picture of Thomas Edison on it. Because he thought that the important thing was the technology. The important thing is that you're listening to a record on my machine, not who are you listening to. And that proved to have disastrous consequences eventually for Thomas Edison, because what happened was the music business got very, very, very big in the 19-teens and the early 1920s, and then in 1923, radio got introduced, commercial radio. And in 1923, the same way that like around 2002, 2003, everybody ran out and for Christmas in America, you know, bought an iPod when it was a new thing. So in 1923, everybody ran out and bought a radio. In fact, it was called Radio Christmas in the trade. And everyone said, oh, this is going to be terrible because radio is going to kill the music business. Because why is it going to kill the music business? Because now you can get music for free. right? Who's going to pay for music when you could get music for free? And what happened? They were right. It killed the music business. From 1923 to 1927, the music business shrunk by 95%. Okay, take that number in for a second. Okay, it was a 12 million. Okay, right. So it was $120 million business in 1923. It was a $6 million business in 1927. Okay, because music was free. Now, we all know this story because this story repeated itself 10 years ago after the coming of Napster and the coming of downloading. Music was free, and all of a sudden, the music business collapsed. But the music business has proven to be very resilient, as we know, and it reconstituted itself. How did it reconstitute itself after the destruction at the hands of radio? What happened was, at the time, the radio companies actually bought all the surviving record companies to get their stars. Edison, by the way, went out of business at that time because he didn't have any stars. And so we see the importance of stars and of talent and of people who can make great music and people who can capture the imagination of audiences. And that's really what's magical about the music business. It's not so much the machine that you play it on, it's what you're playing. So Edison goes out of business because he doesn't have any stars. The rest of the labels who survive get sold to the big radio networks. And a new model emerges where the same star will make a record for the record company, will make a movie for the movie company owned by the company that owns the record company, a musical movie, because movies were just starting in the 30s, talking movies were just starting in the 30s, and would have his own or her own radio show on the radio network owned by the same company. So, you know, we talk in the modern world about this 360 model of where a record company will own an artist publishing and get a piece of their live income and get a piece of their merchandise income. That model was actually created in the 1930s, and it saved the music business. So you have a star like Bing Crosby, who was actually the biggest star in America in the first half of the 20th century, and he made, you know, records for Decca, and he made a radio show for NBC, and he made movies for RKO Pictures, and they were all owned by the same company. So he was their guy. And the music business, you know, had a very good run from that point on through, you know, the coming of the album and the coming of the 45 RPM single, the coming of cassettes, the coming of the CD. Interestingly, all of those technologies were actually created by the same companies that owned record labels. So in fact, the record labels were creating their own technologies to further their own business. So Columbia Records invented the LP. RCA Records invented the 45 RPM single. The cassette was invented by Philips, which owned Polygram. The CD was invented by Philips jointly with Sony, right? And Sony at the time actually wasn't even in the music business, but because they invented the CD, they said, ooh, this is great and it's going to be very profitable. So they got into the music business and they bought CBS Records, which was a very shrewd move at the time. Interestingly, there's really no proof for this, but I've always had this theory, you know, in the late 1990s, Philips and Sony, who created the CD, invented the recordable CD. And that was in some ways the beginning of the end, you know, because it really made piracy so easy. And shortly after the introduction of the recordable CD, Philips sold Polygram to Universal. And I've always had this theory in the back of my head that maybe they understood that the best days were over, and now people could really duplicate music without any loss of quality very easily, and maybe it's time to get out. But in any case, at that point, Philips sold and got out of the music business. The best year in the history of the music business was 2000. It was at its all-time peak in terms of sales and in terms of profits. And then, of course, Napster came, and we know that story, that illegal downloading really started to decimate the music business. And the music business really had some very bad years until the introduction of the iTunes store in 2003. Interestingly, you know, there's a lot of debate to this day about whether iTunes saved the music business or whether the music business saved Apple. Because, you know, at the time, Apple was actually not the mammoth monster that it is today. It was actually somewhat struggling. And the question is, did the iPod and the ability to sell music save Apple? It certainly did save the music business, though, the iPod. And that was a model that we learned to live with. We had gone from the $15 CD to the $1 download. But we could live with that, and then all of a sudden, of course, in the last few years, the $1 download gave way to the 1/3 of a penny stream. and that's a very different world. And the coming of streaming, most notably, obviously, with Spotify, but also with Apple Music and the other streaming services. YouTube, of course, is one of the most important services for listening to music, not just video, in the world. We really changed for the first time the way that people consume music. Until streaming, music was always monetized at the point of purchase, one time. So that means you would buy a record, and you'd hand over your money, and that's the total monetization for that piece of music from you to the creator of the music. And it didn't matter whether you took that record home and listened to it 1,000 times or 100 times or 10 times or once or never. Maybe you gave the record as a gift to your uncle and he never even took it out of the wrapping, right? Maybe it doesn't really matter, right? You paid your money and you're finished, and that's it. Streaming turns that completely upside down, because now the only thing that matters is how many times you listen to a piece of music. And that has changed everything in the music business, because now really the question is, how do you introduce music, market music, and sustain interest in pieces of music long enough? And we live in a world now where really the number of people who listen to a piece of music isn't as important as the total number of listens. So in other words, you could have a million people listen to a piece of music once each, and that's actually less valuable than 100,000 people listening to the same piece of music 20 times each. And so it changes the dynamic and it changes the marketing of music, which is, I think, a very kind of important change as we go forward in the music business. Also, the coming of streaming and the ease of introduction has, of course, as we know, lowered the barrier to entry for musicians. So now, of course, anybody can make a piece of music, and it's easy to do it at home because of new technology, and recording technology has become so much more sophisticated, of course, that you don't need a studio anymore, and you don't even need to play instruments anymore. So people with talent can actually make music in their bedroom, and they have no problem putting the music up on the streaming services. And what we see from that is that it's really interesting. Obviously, we know that there's more music by more people up on the streaming services. And what we learned is that, in fact, there really are more people capable of making music that an audience will enjoy than we used to think. In fact, the old barriers in the music business essentially created an artificial scarcity. Right? We thought that the number of people who could be signed to a record label and the number of people whose music can fit on a radio station's playlist, that's really the number of people who, make great music that people want to hear. And now we learned that number actually could grow exponentially. It could be 10 times as many people can make music that could find a significant audience in the world of streaming. And it's very exciting for creators, obviously. And in some ways, it's a golden age for music creators, because anybody with a good idea can get in there. At the same time, there's a corollary, which is that in this world where so many people have an opportunity to get in and get a little piece, we see that the most valuable thing that you can earn in the music business and in the whole entertainment business, maybe even in the whole of popular culture, is the ability to command an audience. Meaning, if you're somebody who can command an audience, you could actually get much bigger than anybody used to be. So even though there's so many people kind of in the long tail that we call it, right, the people at the head are bigger than they ever were before. We really do live in a rich get richer culture in the music business, in the sense that the biggest stars, in fact, command more of the attention than they ever did before. In the old days, like when I was a teenager, in the charts in America, on Billboard charts, there were about 30 to 40 number one songs every year. Last year, there were 8 number one songs for the whole year. Once you command the attention of the culture, you could really hold it for a very long time, because all the gatekeepers, whether it's the people making Spotify playlists or programming the radio or deciding who will be on television, they all want the very biggest people who have managed to succeed and win. So really, it's a combination winner take all with a very, very long tail society. And it's interesting. I see that I'm running out of time, but I will just finish by saying that I think for monetization and for people, you said, how do we make money? Clearly the rules have changed quite a bit. Spotify isn't a level playing field. We pretend that it is. Anybody can put music in, but there are those playlists, and when you get on those playlists that are made by Spotify's editorial staff, that's how you really win. It's very hard to win without getting on those playlists, and those playlists are a very opaque, very mysterious world. Even for the biggest record companies, we have a lot of trouble understanding, what they want and how they make their decisions. They don't tell you in advance what they're going to put on the playlist. You cross your fingers. You spend months in the studio making a record, and then you kind of throw it out there, and you hope that they accept it. And so it's a whole new. It's always this sort of game of cat and mouse. To try to figure out how the rules are changing and how to win by the new rules. But I would say it's never been a more exciting time to be a musician, to be a producer, to be a record company. The challenges keep changing, but clearly I think we really do live in a golden age. Anybody can have a hit, and that's the best thing that I can think of. So thanks a lot.